it's found in Genesis chapter 48, and the whole chapter is just 22 verses. So Genesis 48.
Genesis chapter 48. Now it came to pass after these things that Joseph was told, "Indeed, your father is sick." And he took with him his 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. And Jacob was told, "Look, your son Joseph is coming to you." And Israel strengthened himself and sat up on the bed. Then Jacob said to Joseph, "God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me, and said to me, Behold, I will make you fruitful and multiply you, and I will make of you a multitude of people, and give this land to your descendants after you as an everlasting possession. And now your 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, who were born to you in the land of Egypt, before I came to you in Egypt, are mine, as Reuben and Simeon, they shall be mine. Your offspring, whom you beget after them, shall be yours. They will be called by the name of their brothers in their inheritance. But as for me, when I came from Paddan, Rachel died beside me in the land of Canaan on the way, when there was but a little distance to go to Ephrath. And I buried her there on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem. Then Israel saw Joseph's sons and said, "Who are these?" Joseph said to his father, "They are my sons, whom God has given me in this place." And he said, "Please bring them to me, and I will bless them." Now the eyes of Israel were dim with age, so that he could not see. Then Joseph brought them near him, and he kissed them and embraced them. And Israel said to Joseph, "I had not thought to see your face, but in fact God has also shown me your offspring." So Joseph brought them from beside his knees, and he bowed down with his face to the earth. And Joseph took them both, Ephraim with his right hand toward Israel's left hand, and Manasseh with his left hand toward Israel's right hand, and brought them near him. Then Israel stretched out his right hand and laid it on Ephraim's head, who was the younger, and his left hand on Manasseh's head, guiding his hands knowingly, but Manasseh was the firstborn. And he blessed Joseph and said, "God, before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has fed me all my life long to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from all evil, bless the lads, let my name be named upon them, and the name of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and let them grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth." Now when Joseph saw that his father laid his right hand on the head of Ephraim, it displeased him. So he took hold of his father's hand to remove it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. And Joseph said to his father, "Not so, my father, for this one is the firstborn. Put your right hand on his head." But his father refused and said, "I know, my son, I know. He also shall become a people, and he also shall be great. But truly his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his descendants shall become a multitude of nations." So he blessed them that day, saying, "By you Israel will bless," saying, "May God make you as Ephraim and as Manasseh." And thus he set Ephraim before Manasseh. Then Israel said to Joseph, "Behold, I am dying, but God will be with you and bring you back to the land of your fathers. Moreover, I have given to you one portion above your brothers, which I took from the hand of the Amorite with my sword and my bow."
We're continuing looking at the wonderful story of Joseph, and it's intermingled here very much with his father Jacob. And before we look at the verses that Kath kindly shared with us from Genesis 48, I just want to remind yourself of some of the history for Jacob. Remember that Jacob was one of twins. He had a brother Esau. Esau was the firstborn. And if you remember, when their mother was carrying the twins, she inquired of God because she could sense something was up. And God told her she would have two babies. And God said something quite striking culturally. God said the younger would be dominant over the older. The elder would serve the younger. And Jacob was that younger brother. He had seen God's hand upon his life. He had seen those things worked out. But if you looked at how his mother went about getting the birthright for her youngest son, what she did was wrong. She tricked her husband. She tricked Jacob's father. Jacob pretended to be Esau. And that trickery, that treachery, led to a rift in the family for over 20 years. And as a result of that treachery, Jacob had to leave home, because Esau would have killed him. He literally would have killed him. So he had to flee home. Rachel said, don't worry, it won't be long. Just a few days. It was 20 years. 20 years. Rachel never saw her boy again. By the time he came home, Rachel had passed away. You see, God had spoken and God had revealed his will. But we don't trick people to help God. No. We don't need to do that. We can trust God that God's wills and God's purposes will be fulfilled. And we definitely don't need to deceive people in order for God's purposes to be fulfilled. And Jacob had experienced that. Jacob had known that. And we need to understand that so that we can see what's happening in chapter 48. And we understand why it happens the way that it does. So that's the context, that's the background to it. Let's refresh ourselves as to where we're at with the story. Joseph, incredibly enough, has been found alive and well. He is governor there in Egypt. He's in charge of all the food distribution. His brothers have been assured that they have been forgiven for their treachery in selling him into slavery. And Jacob and all the family have been invited to come down and to dwell in Egypt. And we looked last week at the struggle that would have been for Jacob to leave the promised land and how God understood the struggle he was having. And God told him, don't worry, I'll be with you when you go down and I'll be with you when you come back up. It's only for a season, it's only for a time. That timeline was 400 years. But he went down a family of 70, he came back a nation of 3 million. God prospered them. God was with them, and it was all part of the plan of God. So Jacob went down at 130 years of age. It's not bad, is it? Going on a trip to Egypt at 130. And he dusted off his passport. He travelled down. And him and Joseph were reconciled for another 17 years. He's 147 at the time of this chapter, at the time of these events. So they had 17 years to make up for the 22 years they'd lost when Joseph was sold into slavery. Jacob asked a promise of Joseph, and we find it at the end of chapter 47. We didn't read it earlier, but just to look at some verses at the end of 47. When Jacob knew he was coming to the end of his life, he sent for Joseph. Verse 29 says, when the time drew near that Israel, that's Jacob's other name, Israel, Jacob, the same person, when the time drew near that Israel must die, he called his son Joseph and said to him, now if I have found favour in your sight, please put your hand under my thigh and deal kindly and truly with me. Please do not bury me in Egypt, but let me lie with my fathers. You should carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burial place. And he said, I will do as you have said. Then Jacob said, swear to me. It wasn't enough, just a yes, Dad. He wanted to know, you'll definitely do it. Swear to me. So he swore to him and said that he would do it. So Israel bowed himself on the head of his bed. He was content to know that his bones would not be laid there in Egypt. They would return home. When he died, Joseph honoured that pledge to his father, and his bones were taken to Israel. something else happened towards the end of Jacob's life. And again, Joseph is involved. When Joseph hears that his father is at the point of death, Joseph goes to see him. It's very interesting that he doesn't go on his own. He takes his two sons with him. He takes Manasseh and Ephraim. And Manasseh is the eldest boy, and Ephraim is the younger boy. A couple of years between them. Manasseh is the oldest. Look at verse 2. It tells us that when Jacob heard that his son Joseph was coming, he strengthened himself. He got whatever resources of strength were left in him, and he sat up on the bed. He wanted to have this conversation with Joseph. He wanted to give this blessing. So he steels himself, he sits up on the bed, and he comes in and he reminds Joseph of the good God that they serve. He reminds Joseph of God's promises to them. And then he looks at Ephraim and Manasseh, and he says, these two boys are going to share in this inheritance and in this promise. Your two boys are going to be adopted by me. They're not going to be viewed as grandchildren. They're going to be viewed in the same way as my children. They're going to have the same rights and the same privileges as my children. I will treat them the same as Reuben and Simeon. Reuben and Simeon were his firstborn, the two eldest boys. And he looks at Manasseh and Ephraim and he says, Joseph, your boys are going to become like my boys. They're going to become part of the inheritance. All that I've talked to you about is going to be theirs to share as well. And that is why, when you look at the tribes of Israel, you don't find the tribe of Joseph. It's not out of spite that Joseph isn't there. It's out of the good hand of God. Because Joseph is not there because he passed his blessing onto his children. And Ephraim and Manasseh are named amongst the tribes of Israel. They are named alongside Jacob's other children. They are treated as children, not grandchildren. Joseph allowed that blessing to pass to his children. Jacob goes on to explain to Joseph that he had given up all thought of ever seeing his son again. For those 22 years where there was no news, when all he had was the blood-stained coat that had been brought to him, for those 22 years he thought his son was dead, and he didn't think he'd ever see him again. But look what he says in verse 11. And Israel said to Joseph, I had not thought to see your face, but in fact, God has also shown me your offspring. God surprises us sometimes, doesn't he? Sometimes we wonder if we will see the blessing of God that we've been promised. We sometimes wonder if we'll see the blessing of God that we expect. Well, often we don't get what we expect, we get more, don't we? God is an abundant God. God is capable of doing far over and above anything we can ever imagine or think. And so Jacob, a few years earlier, thought he would never see Joseph again. And here he is now, and he's looking at Joseph's boys. He's looking at Manasseh and Ephraim. And then, because he knows that his time on earth is limited and is due to come to an end, he wants to bless Joseph's boys. So he is stood there, and Joseph brings the boys to him. And Joseph is very deliberate to make sure that Manasseh, as the eldest, comes to Jacob's right hand. Because that is his portion as the eldest, to receive that extra blessing. He is to receive the blessing from the right hand of Jacob. And then Ephraim, as the younger brother, he is on the left side of Jacob. So Jacob's left hand will be on him. So when the brothers are blessed, the natural order of things will be right, and Manasseh will receive the extra blessing for being the eldest of the two boys. If you think about the scene, the boys have got their heads bowed. The boys are just going to be prayed for. But what Jacob does is something quite striking. Jacob does this. Crosses his hands. So his right hand, instead of going onto Manasseh's head, his right hand goes across onto Ephraim's head. And his left hand goes onto Manasseh's head. Another lovely thing about it is the boys would have been totally oblivious to that. They wouldn't have seen that because they've got their heads bowed in front of it. This is going on above their heads. They don't see that. So he does this. He crosses his hands. And when he prays for them both at the same time. He doesn't make a point of praying for either one of them first. He prays for them together. And he knows in the crossing of his hands, he knows that God is speaking to him. But he's not allowing the brothers to see what's happening. You see, Jacob has lived in a family where that was publicly known. Jacob has suffered disharmony and discord in the family where the natural order of things changed. And so he's doing it in such a way that the older brother is totally oblivious to what is going on. So that Manasseh doesn't see that his blessing is going to Ephraim. He doesn't see it. And Jacob just prays for them both. And he prays that God will bless them both. But then something happens that is quite sad in one sense. Because in verse 17 it tells us that the one who could see what was going on was Joseph, the father. And the Bible tells us in verse 17 that when Joseph saw that his father had crossed hands and that his right hand was now resting on the head of Ephraim, the Bible says this, it displeased him. It annoyed him. Joseph, as godly as he was, when he saw his father doing that, it wound him up. It wound him up. He was a bit angry about it. So angry, in fact, that he actually takes hold of his father's hand and he literally tries to move it onto Manasseh's head. Verse 18, he says, "Not so, my father. This one is the firstborn. Put your right hand on his head." If Joseph hadn't said a word, Manasseh would have never known. But Joseph has now brought it to the boys' attention as to what is going on above their heads. He is displeased by it. And he tries to stop it. "Not so, my father. You've got it wrong. The eldest is Manasseh." And at 147, his father stays strong. Doesn't buckle, doesn't give in, doesn't back down. His father stays strong. His father refuses to move his hand. It's quite comical in one sense. This 147-year-old grandfather, and you've got godly Joseph, who everybody respects and everybody looks up to. And yet Jacob is there and his hand refuses to budge. And then he turns to Joseph and he simply says this, "I know, my son. I know. Don't think that this is your confused old dad just getting it wrong. I know what I'm doing. I know. I know. And he will become a people. And he will be great. But truly his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his descendants shall become a multitude of nations." You see, he had picked up something from God that even godly Joseph had missed. Sometimes, when it comes to our own children, we're sometimes too close. We sometimes struggle and fail to see what God is doing because we're too close to it. And Joseph thought that things would go on the way that they always had. Joseph thought that Manasseh would be the one to receive the extra blessing. But God was speaking to Jacob and telling him that Ephraim would be the more dominant one. And that's exactly what happens in the history of Israel later. Ephraim takes a far more dominant role than Manasseh ever does. But what I love about this is how different it is to what happened with Esau and Jacob. Esau and Jacob, it was all done in disharmony and treachery and discord. Here, the blessing is switched, but it's done from a heart of love. And it is done not to cause any discord between the two brothers at all. And if Joseph had only been in tune with what God was doing, the brothers would have been totally oblivious as to what happened. You see, Jacob has suffered the results of bearing the call of God upon his life. You see, Jacob didn't choose to receive God's blessing above Esau. God chose to give it to him. And when we're privileged to be the children of God, sometimes there's a price that comes with that walk, isn't there? And Jacob had suffered because people tried to help God in what God was about. And they went about things in completely the wrong way. And so he has learnt. And when now he is blessing his grandchildren, he's trying to avoid any discord and any disharmony amongst them. He doesn't bless them separately, he blesses them together. He doesn't make a big show of getting them to swap sides, so he's got Ephraim on his right. He does it discreetly. Unfortunately, his heart is foiled because of Joseph's inability to see what God is about. And yet, even in that, the way that he addresses Joseph is angry and displeased with his father. The Bible says that a kindly word can take away the sting of an argument. And those words, I know my son, I know. But you see, he was his son. And he needed to remember that Jacob was still the head of the family. And Jacob was still operating as the appointed head of the family by God. And yes, it would come to Joseph and his boys to have more responsibility later in life. But even at 147, God can still speak to Jacob and can still show him things. And at 147, Jacob's role for being the channel of blessing for God to his family is still working and it's still functioning. Jacob then turns to Joseph in verse 21. And look at how he addresses him. There could have been so much tension in the air because of what had happened with the two boys. Look at how Israel, how he addresses Joseph in verse 21. Then Israel said to Joseph, Behold, I am dying. He knew his time was coming to an end. I am dying. But God will be with you. What a wonderful thing to say, isn't it? I will soon pass away. But it doesn't change the fact that there is a God in heaven who loves you and is looking out for you. And as his earthly parent, he understood the pain that he would now have to leave Joseph behind for a while. Yes, they could be reconciled in heaven, of course. But he knew that his ability to help, his ability to minister, was coming to an end. I am dying, but God will be with you. You see, when Jacob passed away, Joseph still had his relationship with God. And people around and about us can be a wonderful help and support for us. But nothing is to replace the help that we get from God. And God has promised that he will be with us and speak to us and help us and lead us and guide us as his children. And that's a wonderful, wonderful promise to have. That God our Father is our guide and our help. And Israel is making sure that Joseph understands that. Yes, I am soon to go, but God will be with you. And God will bring you back to the land of your fathers. Don't set down your roots too well into Egypt, because we're only here for a while. Don't ever lose sight of the fact that God has promised us another land. There's a truth in those words for us tonight, isn't there? Don't set down your roots too deep on earth. This is not our home. There is another land that's being prepared for us. There is the promise of eternity in heaven with God, and that is our home. And we will know God as our Father, and we will spend eternity with Him. So don't look to spend all your time here. We're just pilgrims passing through. But our true home is with Father in heaven. And yes, it's lovely that Joseph and Jacob were reconciled. It's lovely that Joseph came back into Jacob's life towards the end of his days. Lovely that Jacob had the opportunity to meet Joseph's children. He had the opportunity to bless them, for them to be incorporated into the blessing of the nation of Israel, for them to receive the honour of having the tribes of Israel named after them as well. All that is wonderful. But nothing is more wonderful than this, that God has promised that He will be with us and that we will be with Him. And eternity is not just a wishful thing. Eternity is reality. It's this world that is temporal. It is this world that will one day come to an end, but eternity will last for eternity. Heaven is there to be gained and to be enjoyed and to be won. And we thank God for the example and the wonderful stories that we have from the people who've gone on before us. But nothing takes the place of the personal relationship that we have with God for ourselves. And that promise that Israel gave to Joseph, God will be with you, is the same promise that we have tonight. God has promised that He will be with us. Whatever we go through in life, whatever circumstances and situations we find ourselves in, God will be with us. He will help us, He will sustain us, and He will give us the strength we need for every day, because He is a faithful God and He is a loving Father.